Salve Skipoli. We are talking about looms and weaving today. This is a great picture. It shows you a warp-weighted loom, um, and these are the weights that keep the strings taut while our little Roman woman here weaves through. And as she's weaving this toga, notice that the garment is much bigger than the one that she's wearing, so it's obviously not for her. It is for a man, it's for wrapping around him, so it has to be a lot bigger, and those stripes have to be more prominent. Um, Now, as we go through this PowerPoint, you need to have the reading. If you don't, that's okay, you can just listen, but it follows along the reading uh, exactly. I actually put the paragraphs in the reading up. So the parts that are underlined in on each slide, those are the parts you need to highlight and study and look over and make sure you know for the test. Okay. So let's start. We have textiles were much more a part of an average person's life in Rome. They made their own clothes a lot of times. Many households had their own loom. And in the country they would even have the sheep to take the wool from. Okay, so um, I have a little question down here. What is the modern household loom? That would be the sewing machine. We still do this to a point, but like the last slide said, it's much more a part of the Romans' lives than it is ours. There are several reasons for the sparse amount of evidence we have left over today about all these looms and everything. And the main reason is that the materials that they used were perishable. So they were wooden, they were string, they were fabric. Pretty much the only thing we really have left over are the stones that they used for weighting it down. Wood doesn't survive for 2,000 years unless it's frozen or in really, really dry conditions. So that doesn't happen a lot in Italy in either situation. And another reason is for that there are a small number of artifacts. The fabric itself is also perishable. Now, if fabric is submerged in water in addition to being dry or frozen, it can survive as well. Now, what else doesn't last for 2,000 years, but we know that the Romans had? Now, this is just a little thinking question. You could say anything like food, things we know that they had, things that we read about, but things that we can't actually experience or see for ourselves today. Okay? The ancient evidence is presented in archaeological remains of loom tools. So the tools are what we have left over, not the products of the loom, which are often made out of terracotta. Terracotta lasts for a while. Stone or bone. Bone, not so often later on in the Roman Empire. I don't want you to think they're barbarians using human bones or something. As well as the surviving pieces of cloth, which are few and far between, but they're still there. There are few depictions, so that means the Romans and the Greeks, they're painting pictures of people weaving or looms. It was a sign of the household, a sign of women in general. So it wasn't too sparse there. It also helps to fill out our picture of the ancient weaving situation. Because we don't have things left over, seeing them in pictures that we have left are really important. Roman literary sources as well, so people writing about looms and weaving. They describe spinning, and spinning as in spinning the wool into thread. Through the use of modern comparative evidence, there's certain parts of the world that still use a lot of these practices, and we can kind of compare them. So let's just review the 5 sources we have from of all of this information. We have some archaeological evidence. Roman art and Greek art, I separated them because they are different, and we get different information from them. We have Roman texts and comparative evidence. There are 3 main types of looms to consider. I mentioned already the warp-weighted loom. The 2-beam vertical loom came later, and then the horizontal loom came for larger projects. The warp-weighted loom was the earliest developed and most commonly used. So this is a lot like our sewing machine, like we said. The type of loom known as the two-beam vertical was used wisely as in the empire by the end of the first century A.D. The horizontal loom was common, at least in the eastern provinces, by the middle of the third century. Now, as we listed them, warp-weighted, two-beam, and horizontal looms, that was the order that they appeared in the sort of timeline of looms and weaving. And just so we're on the same page, I wanted to ask you, when is the first and third centuries AD? So let's look at that. First century AD, when the two-beam vertical loom showed up, is between year 1 and year 99 AD, so after Anno Domini, after the birth of Christ. Then we have the third century AD, which is the 200s. Uh, let's see. The warp-weighted loom is constructed of two upright beams, like the picture we saw at the beginning, connected at the top by a bar called the cloth bar. And we have absolutely no Roman looms today that we've found so far. But if you think about it, we've only been digging things up for a little over a century, so we have a lot of places to look still. The number of warp threads on the loom depends on the desired width of the fabric. So on the picture at the beginning, it was a really wide piece of fabric, but when that woman made the clothing she was wearing, it didn't have to have as many threads on it because it was not as wide. A beam parallel to the cloth beam is called the shed rod and helps to keep the evens and odds apart, and that means every other thread as you weave through them. Open space between the two sets of warp thread is called the natural shed. So this is the space you're putting the strings to go horizontally through. And in your reading, you have a picture of a warp-weighted loom, and I'd like you to label that cloth bar, upright beams, warp threads, and the natural shed for me. Just like I have here. So the cloth bar goes across the top, the upright beams on the sides, warp threads are held down by warp weights, but the threads here are actually the ones that are coming down vertically. If you take a side view of this, you see the space between the two, the evens and the odds, the two sets of strings, and that's your natural shed. These warp threads are gathered and tied at the bottom to a cord which is strung through a warp weight. Warp weights ensure the warp threads do not blow in the breeze or get tangled. That would be terribly annoying if you constantly had these threads getting tangled. The heddle rod is placed halfway up the height of the uprights and sits in supports from which it can be removed. The thread that is being used to weave, called the weft or woof thread. So I want you to have these definitions. What adjective do you associate with the heddle rod? And just to review, the heddle rod is placed halfway up the height of the uprights and sits on supports from which it can be removed. So just think about that. How might you describe that for me if I ask in class? The second major type of loom was the two-beam vertical loom. In many ways, it is similar to the warp-weighted, but it has multiple sheds. The difference between the two looms is how the warp threads are placed on the loom. There's a second beam at the bottom, like the cloth beam at the top. Draw another diagram at the bottom of your reading for what you think this looks like. So take all of this information here and come up with a little diagram for yourself. It should hopefully look something like this. Hopefully you notice that this person is sitting. This is a big deal for the two-beam vertical loom. Two-beam vertical loom is a loom in which the warp threads are under tension, not simply weighted by gravity in those warp stones. So which loom would the Romans have considered an antique? Remembering the timeline of looms, hopefully you can arrive at the warp-weighted loom would be an antique in the 1st century AD once the two-beam vertical loom came out. There are differences in the products of the two types of looms. Cloth woven on a warp-weighted loom can also be considerably larger. For like a big toga like that woman was making at the beginning. Warp-weighted loom is actually larger, but that also makes the two-beam vertical a little bit more convenient. The shed on a warp-weighted loom can be wider. The two-beam vertical loom can be used as a tapestry frame, so more than just clothing can be done on the two-beam vertical. The weaver to warp weighted loom stands and they sit at a two beam vertical loom. So that's important. Give three reasons the two beam vertical loom was an improvement from the warp weighted loom. You sit to weave, which can be much better on the back. You rely on tension instead of gravity, which can be a little more precise. You can make tapestries, so a little more versatility there. The third type of Roman loom, which is a horizontal loom, originally in the area of Syria, evidence for the horizontal loom is much scarcer. Less time out there and less common. So if not everybody has one, it's harder to find evidence for the archaeologists. It is believed, though, that some type of horizontal loom was used in the later Roman Empire because of the types of fabric which has survived. So we can look at what's left and sort of make this kind of a conclusion. So we can thank the archaeologists for that one. It is easier to have multiple heddle rods and thus more sheds on a horizontal loom, so you can have more detail from a horizontal loom. It would not have been as widely used because they're very large. Fabric woven on a horizontal loom would have been too expensive for many people to afford even the materials for it. So once the horizontal loom arrived, this meant more blank clothing instead of homemade clothing. Manufactured. So this is actually a big societal shift when you're starting to have more people specializing in things and manufacturing things. The warp weights themselves are the most commonly found objects. Like I said earlier, there's not a lot of fabric or looms left, but we have those warp weights. Warp weights are usually shaped as pyramids or spheres with a hole cut through the weight, so it's easy to identify them as an archaeologist. Very few warp weights have been found still in place because looms were set up only when someone needed to weave and taken down when the fabric was finished. It wasn't a permanent fixture in the house. It would be put away because a lot of times they didn't have a lot of floor space. Why wouldn't the common Roman just keep the looms set up all the time? I just answered that question. They lived in insulae a lot of times, or very small, almost like studio apartments. They were extremely small. Weaving combs were made out of wood by the time of the Romans, not bone back here, used to push the weft threads up to create a tighter weave. So once you get the threads through, you have to comb them upwards so that they all stay together. Weaving sword or a spatha. It's a flat, long tool that was put in the shed and pushed the weft up. Pin beaters, which are used to push up the weft and untangle knots, are shaped roughly like a cigar. Why aren't there a lot of Roman weaving combs left? You should be looking right here. They were made out of wood. Wood doesn't survive unless it is frozen or dry. They were made out of wood. And you don't need anything in that paragraph. There is one depiction of a warp-weighted loom from a gravestone found at a site in Spain, so we know a lot from that. There are no other pictorial representations of warp-weighted looms which have been found from the Roman period. When is the 2nd century AD and the 5th century BC? Okay, so 2nd century AD, these are the 100s in Anno Domini, the year of our Lord, after Jesus Christ was born. And then the 5th century BC are the 400s before Jesus Christ was born. So we have 400 years before that for the BC. Weaving contest between Arachne and the goddess Minerva. Try to find out because I'm almost out of time. So what's the story of Minerva and Arachne? Just try to give me a quick summary. That is your instruction for the end. Find out about Minerva and Arachne. You put that in Google and it'll tell you right away. But it's a really interesting story. So enjoy. Straw out.